I'm Rabbi Cooper and want to commend everyone for being here bright and early. But while we're waiting, you have really two choices. I can tell you actually a fairly decent joke, which I'll probably say anyway, using this wonderful prop that Lawrence had given to me. But I think maybe more importantly, there's a Wall Street Journal article this morning about the Rialto School District in California, which this past February, all 2,000 eighth graders in this Southern California school district, as part of a core curriculum of teaching creative thinking and critical thinking, were given an 18-page assignment to what they were supposed to talk about was that the Holocaust did not happen and was an invention of people who wanted to make money. And that in addition to that, the kids were already supplied with 18 pages of Chomer material, all of which was downloaded from the hate sites of the internet, including a couple of pages on Anne Frank was a fraud. Okay? So when we at the Wiesenthal Center found out about it, and I shared it with one of my colleagues, but just to, I know everyone here has some incredible stories. Try this one on for size. 3 weeks ago, today's Wednesday, right? Yeah? So 3 weeks ago this morning, I received a call from the acting superintendent of this school district. He said, Rabbi Cooper, you have to come to the meeting tonight. We're having a thing. The media is going to be there, etc., but you must come. I said, with all due respect, what do I have to come? I know what I can tell you what you need to do. He says, no, you don't understand. My life has been threatened. I'm getting threatening emails. I said, really? So what is this guy's name? I'm not making it up. Muhammad Islam is the name of the acting superintendent of the district. We did come out, and I found out that these eighth graders, next year in the States, you go into high school, and you may not be in the same district, and they are graduating next Monday. So the first thing we did was to arrange that all 2,000 eighth graders who were exposed to this, 90 miles from LA, would come to the Museum of Tolerance. Thank God we still have access to survivors of the Shoah, so they can actually meet a survivor who went through it. And we've had and we'll be doing some teacher training this summer. But just before I left for Israel, I sent Muhammad Islam the following email. I won't quote it exactly, basically in a nice way saying, if you think this issue is over, it's not. Because we discovered that there were 5 individuals involved in the creation of this unit. And we've been unable to get the names of the people who did so. And we're not even sure it was teachers. It may have even been administration. So, you know, we've sent them a polite message that this issue isn't over until someone takes responsibility for their actions. So everything about this incident is just so, as we say in Chinese, mizazea. But it also informs all of us about the challenges that await us. If anybody here thought that they're going to be retiring anytime soon from this battle, then you walked into the wrong section of Hebrew U. And then to top it all off this morning, Ben,
can I just
yeah, please, if you just add, as a parent, if you can just tell people what happened.
I have 2 children in the New York City public school system, and when I saw this issue raised, I think it was in Tablet a couple of weeks ago, I sent a very polite email to the principal of my older son's school and his class teacher. 2 weeks later, I wanted a guarantee that they would approach the Department of Education to ensure that this filth does not appear in New York City public schools. 2 weeks later, I still have not even had the courtesy of a reply. So Rabbi Cooper has kindly agreed. When I get back to the States, I'm going to send a follow-up email, and I'm going to explicitly CC Rabbi Cooper. And if I don't get a satisfactory reply, I'm going to raise a massive stink about this.
So the conflating of hate with history, it's already underway, even while we still have, Baruch Hashem, survivors and witnesses to those events. It's already well underway. And of course, in this case, we need to figure out if it's not just a matter of Sheino Yodeh Lishol or Tam, but who in this mix perhaps was the Rasha. And in the meantime, our dialogue with the acting superintendent, Mohammed Islam, continues. Okay, Robert, I've come to know Professor Wistridge. We worked very closely on the new exhibition that's opening at UNESCO, which we talked about. When he asked me to chair one of the events, as soon as I saw something that had to do with Russia, I said, that's for me. I was everything I needed to learn in life. I learned 4 weeks in the Soviet Union in 1972. I understood firsthand that famous advertising jingle in the United States that you're in good hands with Allstate. And so
you visit Russia before Russia visits you.
And the other, I want to say also, because we really have 3 outstanding personalities here and who really have what to say in the academic domain. But this is 3 very, very heavy days, and there's not a lot to laugh about in Russia or back in the Soviet Union. But you know what? The Jews there always found a way to laugh and smile. So we're going to try to maybe loosen it up a little bit in the presentation. Anything that goes wrong, you can blame the chairman. So I am an ordained rabbi, and therefore I am required to tell a story before I introduce the 3 speakers. This comes courtesy of Malcolm Homeline, who you may know. So he told a story where he was asked by a non-Jew, all of whose friends were Jewish, businessman. He said, you know what, Malcolm, do me a favor. I would really appreciate, can I come with you to synagogue on Saturday morning? I just want to keep talking about Shabbos, and let me experience one. So I told him, come 9 o'clock, sat next to me, explained to him what a talit was. He showed him the prayer book in Hebrew and English, Birkot HaShachar, the taking out of the Torah scroll, everyone kissing the Torah on the way, very moving, etc. Fantastic. And then when they put the Torah scroll back into the ark, the rabbi came up to the stender, the podium, and took out his watch, made a big thing about taking it off, looked at it, and put it down. Whereupon the businessman asked Malcolm, well, what is that? What does that mean? Does that have any meaning? And he says, trust me, I know this rabbi. It has absolutely no meaning whatsoever. It means nothing. So yesterday, thanks to the watch, yesterday and today we've had really some very powerful presentations. I guess I'm a native New Yorker originally. I live in LA, where a red light is a suggestion. I see they've provided me with the yellow and red lights. I will try to do my share from the chair. But the good news is we have 3 outstanding people who actually have what to say. So we'll try to keep within the ballpark figures that we've been given. Lawrence Weinbaum is director of the Israel Council on Foreign Relations, which operates under the auspices of the World Jewish Congress, and the founding chief editor of its Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs. He's written widely on contemporary Jewish affairs and anti-Semitism in Poland and elsewhere in East Central Europe. His latest book, co-authored with Dr. Darius Libyanka, I will not try to pronounce any of those words because I could start World War III. Translated into Heroes, Hucksters, Storytellers, the Jewish Military Union, was published by the Polish Center for Holocaust Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences. And what's really great, we've discovered, all of us from the session that you already chaired, a man with a great sense of humor who knows how to laugh, and therefore I can see why he selected such a light topic to speak about this morning, anti-Semitism in post-communist Poland. Professor.
Thank you. Rabbi, I think you know now why they say that the hardest job in the world is to be the roll call officer in the Polish army. You know, when we begin to speak about anti-Semitism in Poland, I'm sorry, can you hear me in the back? Is the mic switched on? Perhaps I can dispense with the microphone. Can you hear me if I don't use the microphone? Okay. I'm sorry?
It should be on. It should be on. Otherwise
Is it on now? Maybe we can dispense with the microphone. It's not a big group.
Well, they want to make sure they
Okay.
get the video.
Ah, okay, for the video.
No, sir.
Is this working? Yeah. We're back live. You know, when we begin to discuss anti-Semitism in Poland, or when we're asked to speak about it, people who are in my line of work, we often feel we want to let out a collective sigh of oy vey. I think that one of the things we have to try to do, people who are in the field, whether and people who look at this from a scholarly point of view or for even a more popular one, is to try to evaluate events in Poland in a dispassionate way. And it's very hard to deal with Poland, a country, of course, with a very long Jewish history, which included triumphs, but sadly also tragedies, to do that. But I ask, of course, that we try to the best of our ability to look at events without too much emotion. Our conference today has a certain backdrop, and I would say the backdrop, whether this is something we chose voluntarily or not, is the publication of the survey by the ADL, this Global 100, which is an index of anti-Semitism, according to which 40% of Poland's adult population holds anti-Semitic views. And I would draw to your attention that this is the highest figure of any country in East Central Europe, higher surprisingly than Hungary or Romania. Now, there are, of course, methodological questions about the survey which have yet to be clarified, so I can't really comment on its veracity. But, of course, I would be remiss if I weren't to mention that, because this is a popular current frame of reference. Many people who have been involved in the revival of Jewish life in Poland have expressed dismay and frustration at these findings, especially because so much has changed in Poland since the collapse of communism. And Poland today appears, at least to visitors, and not only visitors, to be a great hothouse of Jewish activity, both intellectual, cultural, and yes, even spiritual. And of course, we have the establishment of the much heralded Jewish Museum of Polish Jewry in Warsaw. And so these, of course, are positive developments which makes those findings all the more surprising. However, other polls, no pun intended, have also revealed troubling findings that indicate that, yes, anti-Semitism is alive and well in modern-day Poland. A national study conducted by the Center for Research on Prejudice at Warsaw University in 2013 found that 63% of the respondents do believe in the idea of a Jewish conspiracy, roughly the same number as in 2009, when 65% of the respondents affirmed that belief. So you basically have a rather consistent situation, no great change, whether for the better or for the worse. 23%, pardon me, were found to hold such traditional religious-based beliefs about Jews, including the idea of Jews as Christ killers and the idea that Jews use Christian blood for ritual purposes. It was also revealed that the provinces of Lublin and Łódź are the most anti-Semitic regions of the country, because these are places, of course, with a large Jewish community, that were traditionally had large Jewish communities, long Jewish history, but these are places that have also been especially hard hit economically by the transformations that Poland has undergone in the last 25 years. That is to say, the shift from a socialist economy to a market one. In April of 2013, the Homo Homini Institute for Public Opinion Research carried out a poll sponsored by the Jewish community in Poland, in which 1,250 17 to 8-year-olds in Warsaw were questioned about their views on Jews. And it should be pointed out that generally people in Warsaw are rather more liberal than in other parts of the country. They have more access to information. Well, that survey revealed that 60% of the respondents said they would not want a Jewish spouse. 45% would be very unhappy if they had a Jew in their family. However, in terms of their knowledge of the Shoah, 44% of those people queried believed that Poles and Jews suffered the same measure of destruction during the war. 27% said that Jews had actually suffered more. 25% said that the Poles had suffered the most. Interestingly, 55.8% were able to identify the name Mordechai Anilevich as the commander of the Warsaw Ghetto insurgents. 68% knew the exact date of the outbreak of the uprising, though 23% thought that the uprising actually ended in the victory of the Jewish insurgents. By the way, I don't know if Israeli students would do much better in such a survey. That's, of course, subject for a different conference. On the other hand, we have the newly elected member of the European Parliament, Janusz Korwin-Mikke, who in a TV interview in which he was asked about the plight of laborers in modern-day Poland, chose to compare their situation with that of Auschwitz prisoners, and he said, and I quote, "Yes, in Auschwitz they were well-oiled. They had 3 meals daily served and guaranteed time of work. They had unchangeable time of work and the certainty of employment," unquote. Of course, we cannot talk about anti-Semitism in post-communist Poland with at least some background information, some passing reference to Jewish history in Poland. As we all know, before the war, the Jewish community in Poland was the largest in Europe, 3.25 million, 10% of the general population, and in many cities and towns, 30% or more, and in some smaller cities, even as many as 90%. As we all know, by the end of 1942, most of the Jews in Poland had been eliminated. Their property had been taken over by locals, and their place in the economy had also disappeared, having been taken over by local Poles. Now, after the war, only a remnant of the Jewish community remained in Poland, and that number quickly dissipated and continued to decrease over the years, in large measure due to the prevailing anti-Jewish ambiance, and certainly in the immediate years after the war, widespread and on occasion even murderous violence, which culminated in the Kielce pogrom. Now, it should be stated here that in communist Poland, there was never any real confrontation with history along the lines of that which took place in Germany. And I say that not, God forbid, to suggest that any Polish acts of commission or omission during the Shoah were at all comparable to Germany's leading role in the destruction of European Jewry, but merely to note that the subject was pretty much taboo. There was no, what you call in German, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, no confrontation with history. And the communist regime ensured that Poles would be portrayed as the victims and never as perpetrators or even accessories or enablers. Jewish martyrology was completely subsumed, almost as a kind of footnote in the story of Polish suffering. And the Jewish dead were basically expropriated. And that is why Paul Lenve once very pungently commented, "Yes, dead Jews make good Poles." When a different picture would occasionally seep through the censorship, it was quickly quashed. Now, after 1968, which marked the last great exodus of Jews from Poland, the Jews basically disappeared from the Polish landscape, if not necessarily from Polish folklore, in which their presence was deeply rooted. Only a few thousand Jews remained, and these people kept a very low profile. The physical traces of an nearly 1,000-year Jewish presence was also being eliminated, whether through deliberate action or just neglect. Now, the Jewish presence in Poland did seem to be on the verge of extinction. At least that's what I believed as an eyewitness to that decline when I was a university student in Poland in the 1980s. And as you can imagine, I could tell you many stories from that period. Perhaps the funniest was when I was at a party in the student dormitory in which I lived. There was a lot of drinking, as you can imagine, and suddenly I received a great compliment from an unexpected quarter. I was standing there, and near me was standing a guy who was very inebriated, oblivious to the fact that my back was facing his. And from across the room to a friend of his, he shouts out, "Larry to Żyd." Larry is a Jew, ale pije jak prawdziwy Polak, but he drinks like a real Pole. So that always will remain enshrined in my memory as the greatest compliment I'd ever received. But certainly when Polish society began to break the shackles of communism in the 1980s and to re-examine its own history, it was impossible to maintain this silence over Jewish issues, and slowly but surely the more inquisitive people involved in that process began to ask questions. How could a group that constituted 10% of the population disappear almost without a trace? And how could it be completely ignored in all of the literature? And this process was actually like the opening of a Pandora's box, in which over time, I would say the best and the worst tendencies in Polish society were unleashed. we could say the rest is history, but that's what we have to deal with. I could also tell you, at this particular time in the 1980s, and forgive me if anybody has heard this anecdote from me in other talks, I always find it relevant. I remember middle of the 1980s, suddenly the publication of a Jewish cookbook, which was quickly snapped up. There were very few Jewish books, Jewish publications of any kind, and a friend of mine said to me, what a strange country this is. A Jewish cookbook being published in a country in which there are no Jews and no food. Over time, Polish historians began to grapple with these issues, especially those associated with the Academy of Science, in which eventually a Center for Holocaust Research was established. And these historians, a very brave lot, who I am proud to say are really my heroes, have played a leading role in bringing about that change. And they have fearlessly confronted even the most sinister skeletons in Poland's closet and have forever altered the way Poles, or at least some Poles, view their own history. And what that means basically is they have stressed that Polish participation in the destruction of the Jews of Poland should not be looked upon as an altogether marginal phenomenon. Okay, thank you very much. We're doing well. And I would say that we should point out that over time, and we're talking about 25 years, a quarter of a century, a number of milestones can be marked in the expose of the Polish reaction to the Shoah during the events in question. You know, each successive milestone in terms of these revelations has produced its own toxic backlash infused with anti-Semitism. Among the most important of these, and this is just going to be a telegraphic list, 1994, the publication of the research on the Warsaw Ghetto, the Warsaw Uprising, pardon me, the General Warsaw Uprising in 1944 by an iconoclastic journalist named Michał Cichy, in which he revealed that during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, some of the Polish insurgents also killed Jewish survivors. His article was published in 1994 and produced a tremendous and very violent backlash. In 2001, the publication of the now famous book by Jan Tomasz Gross, Neighbors, which contained harrowing revelations about the slaughter of the Jewish community of Jedwabne by local townsfolk, which precipitated, I would say, an unprecedented national soul-searching that had really no parallel in post-communist Europe and still has no parallel in post-communist Europe. 2006 and 2011, Jan Tomasz Gross published two successive volumes, one called Fear, which dealt with post-war violence, another called Golden Harvest, which detailed the widespread plunder of Jewish property. That particular book also portrays, for example, the search for gold among the incinerated remains of Jews murdered in Treblinka. All in all, not a pretty picture. In 2011, there was the publication in the leading weekly news magazine, Polityka, of a chilling account of a Polish eyewitness to the robbery, torture, and rape of 18 Jews by local Poles in a village of Gniewczyna Tryniecka in May of 1942. And after finishing with their victims, the Polish perpetrators turned them over to the Germans with all too predictable consequences. Now, the witness who described this, a 12-year-old boy, 12 years old at the time, had remained silent until old age, but shortly before his death, he felt he could no longer keep these excruciating secrets to himself, and he went public with this, and he, again, died shortly thereafter. This was followed in 2011, again, the publication of two books by colleagues of mine, the historians Jan Grabowski and Barbara Engelking, which again revealed a very unvarnished picture of Jewish suffering at the hands of Poles. Grabowski's book was called, tellingly enough, Judenjagd, The Hunt for Jews. It chronicled the way in which local people sought out Jews who had escaped from German hands and basically turned them in, whether for monetary, pecuniary reward or for other incentives. The most recent milestone we mark is in the year 2012. Perhaps some of you have heard of the movie Pokłosza, Aftermath, film written and directed by Władysław Paszykowski. This is a kind of thriller that was inspired by the revelations about Jedwabne. It's a fictional film, but based on real events. The action takes place in a fictional village and begins with the return of a Pole who has lived in Chicago for decades. He learns that his brother is shunned by the local people, the local community, for acquiring and displaying on his farmland dozens of Jewish tombstones, which he discovered had been used by the Germans as paving stones in a now abandoned road. And against the growing opposition of the residents of the town, these brothers attempt to learn more about what happened to the Jews of the village. Well, that precipitated, again, a storm of discussion in the press, not all of it very friendly. It has to be said now that there's no, and I've said this already, but I must stress it, that no post-communist country in Europe has come close to matching Poland's courage or candor in confronting the darkest chapters in its own wartime history. But this strong reaction is basically the prism through which we have to today look at anti-Semitism. I would say that when we try to evaluate the way in which these revelations have been understood, we have to turn to the research, the brilliant research of Michael Shafir that was published actually by this very institution, the Vidal Sassoon Center, and the paradigm of what he called deflective negationism. Now, just in the interest of making this a little bit shorter and not subjecting you to too many unpleasant details, let me just move on to something else. I think I have to say that the reaction, which has been very severe to these kinds of findings, and as I said, was predictably very fierce on the part of Poles who are not necessarily in the intellectual quarters, people who were big losers by the transformation of Poland into a capitalist country, but they were not the only ones to react this way. Even on the highest level of Polish society, again, what you might say from unexpected quarters, there has been very great resistance to accepting the findings of historians who've said Poles cannot be seen as mere bystanders. For example, in a recent interview in Haaretz 2011, during his official visit to Israel, Poland's Oxford-educated foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, claimed, and I quote, "The Holocaust that took place on our soil was conducted against our will by someone else." And instead, to deflect criticism from what went on in Poland, he lashed out at Washington for its real failure to take any meaningful action during the war to save Polish Jews. But of course, what he said flies in the face of the latest research that I have shared with you. In 2010, that's a year earlier, when Princeton University hosted a very prestigious international conference devoted to the theme, and this was the title of the conference, "The Holocaust in Poland, New Findings and New Interpretations," a senior Polish diplomat in the US actually protested against the parley's title and insisted that one could infer from it that Poles and not Germans were the prime perpetrators of the destruction of Polish Jewry. And obviously the organizers of that conference did not have that in mind, but you can see the degree of sensitivity. Let me point out two other such examples. I can identify what we might call ethno-nationalist scholars, historians, who have also been very upset by the findings of their, I would say, more courageous compatriots. One of these is a Polish-American scholar, that is to say, a gentleman born in Poland, but who made his way to the United States, Marek Jan Chodakiewicz. He is affiliated with the Institute of World Politics in Washington, and his research bears the imprimatur of Poland's Institute for National Remembrance, which is a state-sponsored body. He basically has been reluctant to forgive the Jews for Jedwabne and Kielce, in much the same way that many Germans are not capable of forgiving the Jews for Auschwitz. And in one of his books, he charges that Polish violence against the Jews in the immediate post-war period has to be seen as something symmetrical with Jewish violence directed against Poles. And he has also said that the charges of historians, whether Poles or Jews, about Polish complicity in the Shoah has to be seen in a different way. And this is a quotation. I would say his defense strategy has taken this idea of deflection to a new and dizzying height. He has said, and I quote, "For several hundred years now, secular utopians have been bludgeoning traditional foundations of the Western civilization. Lately, the progressives have focused on Poland as a substitute target for a larger assault on traditional American values. They have blamed Poland for anti-Semitism, including an alleged complicity in the Holocaust. This has succeeded because the secularists command the symbols and language of America's discourse," unquote. In other words, those who study the history of anti-Semitism in Poland, including the role of locals in the destruction of Jewish communities, are really attempting to bring down the United States apple pie and motherhood. Now, what is especially bizarre is that a historian with such a twisted take on events served from 2005 until 2010 as a presidential appointee to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. But as we all know, America has never been anything if not a land of golden opportunity. Now, in the 2 minutes I have remaining, I would also point to another such example, a professor connected with the Polish Academy of Science, Professor Krzysztof Jasiewicz, who in 2013, in an interview on the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, 70th anniversary, stated, and this statement unleashed also a very strong reaction. Happily, it enlisted a strong reaction and resulted in this guy losing his position. This is what he said. This nonsense about Jews being killed mostly by Poles was created to hide the biggest Jewish secret. The scale of the German crime was only possible because the Jews themselves participated in the murder of their own people. The Jews have a problem because they are convinced they are the chosen people. They feel they are entitled to interpret everything, including Catholic doctrine. I am convinced that there is no point in dialogue with the Jews because it doesn't lead anywhere. I am completely convinced that the crime at Jedwabne and other pogroms were not committed to seize Jewish property or as revenge for the many terrible things that Jews did to the Poles in the past. The pogroms were mostly motivated by great fear of the Jews. These desperate murderers may have told themselves that they were doing terrible things, but that their grandchildren would be grateful to them. I think that such an interpretation is possible, though it does not absolve them of the crime, said Jasiewicz. And you can imagine this was a very, very shocking statement. I mean, I could go on, but I won't. I have 30 seconds, if not less than that. Let me simply say, as I once concluded a talk about the Roman Catholic Church in Poland, how should we look at what is going on today in Poland? I think we can say the glass is either half empty or half full. There are many problematic things taking place today in Poland, many events that give us pause. On the other hand, the fact that these issues are being discussed the way they are, and the fact that there is a group of very dedicated Polish historians who have not recoiled from telling this story gives me personally cause for optimism and leads me to believe that the glass is half full. I would also say that my own colleague, my own co-writer, who is a very well-known historian in Poland, who is often called to testify at trials involving extreme right-wing violence, the violence of skinheads, has personally had bricks thrown through his window. His car has been twice defaced with swastikas. And I once asked him whether he was concerned, whether this was a cause of worry to him. And he said, I am not going to change anything that I am doing, and I am going to continue in doing what I feel I must. Now, his wife, of course, is of a very different opinion because she has to live in that house. Not a pleasant situation. But again, at the end of the day, all I can do is take off the hat that I am not wearing to my Polish colleagues who persevere nonetheless. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawrence. Our next speaker, Sarah Feinberg, is a research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University and a visiting professor of government at Tel Aviv University's Harold Hartog School of Government and Policy. She received her PhD in political science at Sciences Po Paris in 2008. She previously served as visiting assistant professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Her most recent publications include, and it's in French, so excuse me, Les Discriminations, l'Antisemitisme Soviet après Stalin, which I think it means Anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union after Stalin, which she co-wrote with Jacques Berlinbaum and Aurora No. Secularism on the Edge, Church-State Relations in the U.S., France, and Israel, published this year. Professor Feinberg, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Robert, for inviting me this morning. It's always a pleasure to speak in this forum. In fact, I've just come back from Poland, and it happens that I visited the former Oflags and Stalags that were located previously in Germany, in a territory that became Polish in 1945, Pomerania. And there I met maybe the kind of people that you described in your presentation, people animated by a very strong memory goodwill, people who want to commemorate the experience of Polish and French and Belgian prisoners of war in Pomerania, but that at the same time keep in their worldview a very, very strong biased vision of Jews as being responsible for anti-Polish violence. And I met there with a few people who were born in Kielce. And you mentioned the pogrom of Kielce of July 2nd, 1946, where 42 Jews were killed by the Polish communists, but Jan Gross did a very extensive work on this issue, and he was completely convinced that this pogrom was just a response to previous anti-Polish violence. So here you have a very strange and interesting combination of good memory will with deeply seated prejudice about Jews, including among the youth. So this morning I'm here to speak about a more joyful topic. I'm here to speak about the various metamorphoses of the Jewish card in the Soviet Union and in contemporary Russia. Okay? So in the 20 minutes or so, I would like to take you to a very selective and brief tour of how the Jewish card has been used after the death of Stalin under Brezhnev and in today's Russia. And we're seeing here very interesting and I would say surreal twists that need our full attention today. So now I would like to explore how after the death of Stalin and during the Ukrainian crisis most recently, how the treatment of Jews and discourses about Jews have been used to bolster the legitimacy of power and policy in Moscow. My presentation will be based upon a book that I've just published in Paris about anti-Jewish Soviet discrimination in the Soviet Union after Stalin up to the end of the Soviet Union, and also upon an article that I recently published in the Jerusalem Post about Putin's recent philo-Semitism in the Ukrainian crisis that I think is very interesting. So let me very briefly address the multidimensional discrimination of Jews in the post-Stalinist era and highlight the continuities between the Stalinist and post-Stalinist anti-Semitism. And basically, in the book, I argued that Soviet anti-Semitism did not disappear after Stalin. Rather, it was one dimension of what I call a racist matrix, a racist element that permeated Soviet ethnic policy from the mid-1920s up to the end of the Soviet Union. So let me address this multidimensional aspect, and I would like to mention that Samuel Barnard, here in this room, wrote a groundbreaking work about the experience of Jews in the 1950s, and he will be able to talk about this maybe for a minute. So anti-Jewish discrimination in the post-Stalinist period involves, of course, as you know, social and professional discrimination. Jews were prevented from entering the Communist Party, were ousted from leading positions, were not welcomed in the security and defense sectors, especially in the nuclear industry. As you know, it was rather the same in the United States. I met Americans in Washington, D.C. who wrote P instead of G when they applied for work in the nuclear sector in the 1960s and 70s. Jews who were overrepresented in the sector of mathematics were ousted from this sector, were expelled from this sector in the 1970s and 80s. And so you see a whole series of discriminatory practices. What is interesting here is that the experience of self-marginalization of Jews in the 1960s and 70s in the Soviet Union reminds me of the experience of being put into the margin that French Jews have been feeling ever since the Second Intifada. And this experience was very accurately described and captured by Shmuel Trigano here in this room in a book, L'avenir des Juifs de France, about the future of the Jews of France. Even though the French Jews did not experience state-sponsored and de facto institutionalized discrimination, their experience mirrors in some ways what the Jews has lived during the Brezhnev period. A second aspect of discrimination deals with memory. Okay, as you know, the Shoah was occulted in the Soviet Union. There was a state-sponsored silence about this specific experience of Jews. And this double experience of social, professional, and memory discrimination was amplified by a very aggressive anti-Zionist campaign that was launched in July 1967, 1 month after the end of the Six-Day War. And here I would like to say that the nexus between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, this kind of recycling of old anti-Semitic stereotypes that belong to the pre-revolutionary era, started in the Soviet Union in the summer 1967. What we're seeing today in Western Europe, this very intricate nexus of discourses and images about Jews, I would argue, started in the Soviet Union in the summer 1967, and I think it's the first seeds of what Pierre-André Taguieff called the new Judeophobia. So now, let me transition to today's Russia, okay? And here I would like to highlight a very striking contrast. How many minutes do I have now?
You have 17.
17 minutes, so okay. Before I transition to today's Russia, let me address the question of why. Why were the Jews discriminated against, and what was the agenda of the Soviet power? It will enable me to contrast it with Putin's agenda with regards to the Jews and to Ukraine. The first reason has to do with the staying in power of the Stalinist elites. As you know, there was a young generation of Stalinist cadres, Stalinist elites that were trained in the mid and late 1930s. Most of them were involved in the anti-cosmopolitan campaign of 1949, 1948, 1953. And those people stayed in power until the early 1970s. That means that those people perpetuated, maintained anti-Jewish practices that were introduced during the second Stalinism. A second reason has to do with a major shift in Soviet foreign policy orientation. As you know, the Soviet Union, from being a very pro-Zionist country, became a staunch anti-Zionist power, joining the non-aligned countries and the Arab neighbors of Israel, and therefore the Jews became a suspect minority within the Soviet Union and an enemy from within, accused of double allegiance. Third, Third, anti-Jewish discrimination served another domestic purpose. It served to alleviate inter-ethnic competition, inter-ethnic tensions in and for entering university and reaching or obtaining a certain professional position. So basically, jobs were given to other ethnic groups at the expense of Jews who were perceived as too privileged. Fourth, there was in the 1960s and 70s a very salient return of the myth of Judo Comuna that you mentioned before. As you know very well in this room, this myth portrayed Jews as being the conspirationist power that precipitated the coup d'etat of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And you see in the 1960s and 70s the return of this myth among the Russian and Soviet intelligentsia. And in the 1970s in particular, grandsons and daughters of people who had been repressed in the 1930s started to take revenge against the Jews because they perceived the Jews, or they associated the Jews with the NKVD and the organs of political repressions. Fifth, it served another goal. Anti-Jewish propaganda served another goal, that of disqualifying human rights activists and dissidents that were portrayed as Jewish by definition. That is why in a special KGB samizdat, it was a fake samizdat circulated by the KGB, a person who, in Kolakavod le Solzhenitsyn, is not the great philo-Semite in this world, was renamed Solzhenitsyn. Six, it's the de-Judaization of the Shoah, as it was shown previously by Amir Weiner, promoted the idea of a collective martyrdom of the Soviet people and served to bolster the legitimacy of the Soviet power, because the revolutionary narrative and ideal was exhausted at this time, after World War II. And finally, I would argue that the anti-Jewish discourses served another purpose, what I call kill the Jewish father of the Russian Revolution, meaning hiding the high proportion of Jewish revolutionaries in the revolutionary movement. Now let me come back to the Ukrainian crisis. I would do a major leap. And I would like to speak about today's rhetorics about Jews. I will not address the anti-Zionist discourses. It will be done by Samuel in a few minutes. But I would like to speak about the ways in which pro-Jewish discourses has served Putin's legitimization of the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula on March 16, 21st, a few months ago. As you know, during the Cold War, and I recognized a few people in this room who participated in this propaganda campaign, one of the major tools of Western powers against the Soviet Union was to portray this regime as anti-Semitic. Okay, this was a major weapon of the Cold War, and as you know, the Refuseniks movement and the Soviet Jewry movement were the most successful movement of the Cold War, the most efficient ones. How ironic then that as the Maidan movement has played out in Ukraine over the past 5 months, the Kremlin has reprised this Cold War era accusation of anti-Semitism, but this time to support Moscow's expansion into Crimea. Even as the Western media has themselves indulged in propaganda, they portrayed the Maidan movement as being a pro-European movement, which it was not entirely. So Putin has systematically used accusations of anti-Semitism and Nazi-inspired fascism as a propaganda to delegitimize the protest movement, widely supported by the US, NATO, and the 28 EU members. As you know, Israel has had a very difficult position because Israel has been pressured by Washington and by the European Union to take sides in this very delicate crisis. And one of the arguments was that because those movements had anti-Semitic groups among them, so Israel had to take position. So far, Israel has not taken position. In our institute at the INSS, We've advised the government not to take positions for the moment in this crisis, but it's interesting that this problem came up. On February 13, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov wrote in the popular Russian newspaper Kommersant that, I quote, "The Maidan protests show traces of nationalist and extremist moods that are aligned with anti-Semitic racist appeals." Putin also, in his official address to the Russian parliament on March 18th, for those of you who watched this address, it was a political masterpiece. He justified Russia's opposition to Maidan by portraying the protests as nationalists, neo-Nazis, Russophobes, and anti-Semites that executed this coup. What is interesting is that the 70,000 up to 300,000 white Jewish community in Ukraine that I have tight contact with has not embraced Putin as a Tsar Batyushka, you know. They very clearly dismissed Putin's anxiety about anti-Semitism in Ukraine, not denying, of course, that the party of Svoboda became the fourth party in Ukraine in the last parliamentary elections, and not denying that the Pravi sector, the right sector, is very active in Ukraine. Let me quote Leonid Finberg, who is the head of the Institut Judaiki, the Institute for Jewish Studies in Kiev, and he said on January 27th that the characterizations of the Maidan protest as anti-Semitic are widely circulated lies. Finberg is my name. Finberg is not, it's my megalomania. Finberg and Ukraine's chief rabbi Yaakov Dovblai have both accused Russia of deliberately staging anti-Semitic provocations in Ukraine, including the defacement of the Ner Tamid synagogue in Simferopol, in the Crimean capital, on February 27th, just hours before Russian troops poured into the region. So I can go on with the quotes, but what is interesting to me is that the reason why Putin intervened in Ukraine is to keep his Eurasian project on track. As you know, Ukraine is a major strategic country for Putin's project of building a Eurasian Union between the eastern borders of the European Union and the northern borders of China. And interestingly enough, this project is built upon a very interesting ideology carried or developed by a man named Dugin, Alexander Dugin, who is the head of the Russian Neo-Eurasian movement, and that is driven by an imperial and syncretic vision of Russian nationalism that integrates elements of Bolshevism, fascism, and Nazism, and that is taken by a strong and open anti-Semitic and racist vision of the world. I'm going to finish with a final twist. My final twists are the Sunday elections to the European Parliament that were marked by very expected but still surprising raz-de-marée of populist, extreme right-wing and extreme left-wing parties to the European Parliament. And what is interesting is that in the campaign that led to the European elections, you've seen the crystallization of extreme far right-wing alliance around a support to Putin's Russia. You know that those groups are very much divided. For example, Marine Le Pen doesn't want to do business with the Jobbik in Hungary. Why not? I don't know, but she doesn't want to. And one of the common denominators is some kind of admiration and fascination with Putin's bold moves and challenging of the EU, challenging of the US. And I would like to end with this image of far-right activists literally queuing up in order to enter the Kremlin and have a meeting with Putin. And I would argue that the recent meeting between the Queen of the National Front, Marine Le Pen, And the Duma's president, Sergei Naryshkin, in Moscow on April 12, shows that the Jewish card in Russia has yet a few metamorphoses to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I guess since we're clarifying names, for full disclosure, I think our family's name in Russia was Krupinski before my uncle fled both the Red and the White armies. So it's important. And if I could just take the chair for one more second, you can also add to Stalin, probably as the first Holocaust revisionist, who made a decision at the end of World War II to suppress the Jewish identities of the very high percentage of heroes of the Soviet Union, among his many other crimes. Well, thank you for that very interesting and provocative presentation. Our final speaker, Samuel Barnai, is academic coordinator of the Cherek Center at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry of Hebrew University here in Yerushalayim. He's a research fellow at the Vidal Sassoon International Center for Study of Anti-Semitism and a postdoctoral fellow at the Israel Science Foundation and the Hebrew University. He specializes in large-scale studies of historical, socio-demographic, and cultural developments among Soviet Jewry. Among his recent works are Social Trends During the Khrushchev and Brezhnev Years, The Jewish Case, and Revolution, Repression, and Revival, Jews in the Former Soviet Union. His topic this morning is incredibly important and relevant as a bridge from the past to our current situation: anti-Zionism in contemporary Russia, Eurasian, Islamic, and left populist trends. Samuel, it's all yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank, first of all, Robert, Professor Wistrich, for the invitation to take part in this magnificent conference, and the Vidal Sassoon Center for the support of some of my researches, and Rabbi Cooper for the presentation of my current paper, and also to thank Tara for mentioning my modest contribution to the search of the Soviet Jewry. So I'm going to speak today about the anti-Zionism in contemporary Russia, Eurasian, Islamic, and left populist trends. Although the Soviet regime never denied the right of the State of Israel to exist, anti-Zionism was an essential part of the state ideology from the late 1920s. It played no significant role until the late 1940s, when, after short-term support of the plan to establish the Jewish state, the Soviet regime launched the wide-scale anti-Jewish campaigns camouflaged by the anti-Zionist slogans. The campaigns halted after Stalin's death, and the anti-Zionist trend revived and accelerated in the late 60s, following the Six-Day War and the cutting of diplomatic relations by the USSR. During Gorbachev's perestroika, anti-Zionism ceased to be a part of the state ideology, but it was revealed as one of the basic elements in the ideology of several right and left extremist movements, which flourished under the sun of democratization alongside the severe economic crisis of the 1990s. Those marginal groups continued to exist and gain momentum in post-Soviet Russia. Two factors influenced the development of anti-Zionism in the 1990s. First, there was the collapse of the Soviet superpower state, accompanied by the economic disintegration and mass impoverishment. This led people to be more preoccupied with their permanent imperative need to survive rather than with the situation in the Middle East. Second, the bloody Chechen war and attacks by Islamic terrorists inside Russia itself led the common citizens to an increased understanding and even sympathy for Israel. As a result, strident anti-Zionism served mainly as a euphemism for the imagined Jewish domination of Russian politics, the economy, and the media. It was significantly less focused on Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian or Israel-Arab conflict, inter-Palestinian relations, or the relations of the Palestinian leadership with various groups in the Muslim world. These issues returned to Russian political discourse in the last decade, and we can see in the writings and speeches of three thinkers who present seemingly different trends that they may have much more in common than one may suspect. More importantly, those three have shown willingness to collaborate to various extents, of course, with the Putin regime in hopes of reviving Russia as the superpower state. So let us begin with the first person, Alexander Dugin, please. Yeah? Oh, yeah. He was born in, Sarah mentioned, yes. So he was born in Moscow in 1962. In 1969, he entered the Moscow Aviation Institute, but was expelled after 2 years for falling behind. Presumably, he eventually graduated from the Institute of Engineers of Melioration. In 1980, Dugin joined the clandestine group of intellectuals known as the Black Order of SS, which researched the Nazi esoteric occultist philosophy, sort of Anna Nerbe and stuff like this. In the late 80s, he joined the National Patriotic Front Pamyat and began to work in the press. Yes. Yeah, this is the first Russian nationalist movement in the late Soviet Union, Pamyat. He was influenced in this period by the Western right-wing and conservative thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Mircea Eliade, Karl Haushofer, and others. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Dugin reconsidered his views on communist ideology and turned to the European New Left and New Right, as well as the Russian emigre ideology of National Bolshevism and Eurasianism. As a result, in 1993, he took part in the red-brown communist Nazi anti-Yeltsin rebellion and established the National Bolshevik Party. Please. This is a symbol of the National Bolshevik Party, which is obviously a combination of the Soviet and Nazi symbols, which he subsequently left in 1998. Following that, he became an advisor of Gennady Seleznyov, the chairman of the Russian State Duma, the parliament, and was close to Prime Minister Evgeny Primakov and later to the President Vladimir Putin. He established his own Eurasian party, later renamed it as the International Eurasian Movement. In 2002, please. As one of the demonstrations with the flags of the Eurasian movement, yes, in the downtown of Moscow. The movement was based on Dugin's idea of the Turkic-Slavic alliance in the Eurasian sphere, which was extremely important to the Kremlin during the Second Chechen War. In 2008, he became an official ideologist of Putin's United Russia Party and simultaneously a professor of sociology and handled the Center for Conservative Research in the Department of Sociology at Moscow State University. Since 2012, Dugin had become member of the advisory board of the chairman of the Russian State Duma, Sergei Naryshkin, also mentioned by Sarah just a few minutes ago. The totalitarian, anti-Western, anti-American, anti-liberal, anti-bourgeois ideology led Dugin to support Putin's policy during the crisis in Ukraine in 2004, the occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 2008, and also the 2014 occupation of Crimea and the unofficial intervention in southeast Ukraine. Dugin's neo-Eurasian ideology, besides being the aspect of his personal loyalty to Putin, is a strange synthesis of Russian and Western geopolitics, messianic view of Russia as a Eurasian citadel, or the nucleus of Eurasia, or the geopolitical axis of history. It blends Orthodox Christianity, European neo-Nazism, and left populism, the Byzantine theory of the alliance of spiritual and civil leadership, conservatism, traditionalism, conspiracy theories, and mysticism. It calls for isolation toward the Atlantic world, balanced by partnership with the East. It means India, China, and the Muslim world, while asserting the uniqueness and superiority of the Russian nation, or even Russians, as a race of Aryan origin. The Eurasian sphere controlled by the dominant Russian force should include all the former Soviet republics, except the Baltic states, most of the Balkans, part of the Great Middle East, Turkey, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and Mongolia, accompanied by its threatening influence in India, Pakistan, and parts of the northern China. Yes, please. We see here in the map the zone of the influence. Next one, please. And a more global, and more global, it's very significant part of the world. Yeah. So seemingly Israel is beyond the limits of this sphere. However, Dugin's article, Russia Can Be Great or Not at All, in 1999, reveals that Israel is considered by the author to be a part of the Russian zone of domination, and I quote, "The border of Greater Israel are also very specific, from the Nile to the Euphrates. The daring idea of the most radical Zionists stops beyond those territorial limits. Any further increase of the greatness is considered not through the extensive outer, but through intensive inner development of the nation. Through messianic events, miracles and signs that will spread throughout the world by other channels, but the basis is from the Nile to the Euphrates." And he further added, "We never understand the Israeli settlers whom it was proposed during the peace process to depart. From where? From the land for which they sacred to love and live in it, the nation during the 1,000 years, thousands of years of the diaspora. After all, the parallel Greater Israel did not disappear from any way, from the Jewish soul, from Jewish anguish, from the infinite, embittered, sophisticated sorrow of its grief, from the Nile to the Euphrates, in reality or in dreams. But one should reckon with the fact that as long as the national ideal of Zionism is alive, nobody will sleep in peace, neither enemies nor friends." Such a view resulted from the significant evolution of Dugin's idea concerning world Jewry. In 1994, in his book Conservative Revolution, Dugin wrote that the world of Judaica is hostile to us. He defined the Jewish diaspora of Russia and Eastern Europe as an enemy of Russian nationalism, blamed Jews crucifying Jesus, which symbolically continued with the rejection of the sacred nature of the Byzantine state and Moscow as the Third Rome. Yet he did not propose to solve the Jewish problem through power. In his 1997 article, Jews and Eurasia, Dugin adopted the idea put forth by Yakov Bromberg, a Eurasianist of the 1920s, 1930s, who divided world Jewry into the positive Jewry of the East, and I deliberately translated not as Eastern Jewry, as you may understand. So Jewry of the East, religiously speaking, is Hasidic, Kabbalistic, and secularly it's Bolshevik. And the negative Jewry of the West, religiously, it's Talmudic, rationalistic, and Maimonidic, and secularly, it's enlightened, humanistic, bourgeois, capitalistic, liberal, democratic. All credits to Mr. Dugin. Using this inter-Jewish dichotomy, Dugin explains both the significant role of Jews in the Bolshevik movement and also in the collapse of the Soviet Union by the metamorphosis of the Jewry of the East into the Jewry of the West. According to Dugin, the positive Jewry will contribute to general struggle against Western culture and to the founding of the great Eurasian empire through its conflict with negative Jewry. Under the condition of the inter-Jewish civil war, he is able to reconcile and express respect for Orthodox Jewry and extreme right-wing Zionism. Please. Yeah, as you see, no problem to participate with one of the really extremist right-wing representatives from Israel, like Avigdor Eskin, in this photo. So the second person to consider is Gaydar Jamal, please. Okay. The picture says so. Okay, so Gilad Jamal, who was born in 1947 in Moscow to an Azeri father and Russian mother, and his parents divorced, and he was raised by his Russian grandfather. Jamal entered the highly prestigious Institute of the Oriental Languages at Moscow State University in 1965, but a year later he was expelled for bourgeois nationalism. In the 1970s, he joined the Black Order of SS. In the 1979, he became inactive in the underground all-Soviet Islamic movement and made contact with the Islamic activists in Tajikistan. In the late 80s, he joined the National Patriotic Front Pamyat. Jamal was deputy chairman in the founding the Islamic Renaissance Party in 1990. He participated in 1993 in the Islamic People's Conference in Khartoum, Sudan. In 1995, Jamal established the Supra-Regional Islamic Committee of Russia. From the early 80s, he became an active media personality, establishing the Information Center, a newspaper, producing TV shows on Islamic issues. He is a member of the Coordination Council of the Russian Left Front and a member of the oppositional movement Other Russia. In 2010, Jamal signed the Anti-Putin's manifesto, Putin Must Go. The previous year, he had been accused of praising Islamist rebels in the North Caucasus on his website. However, he wasn't charged for that, surprise, and only changed the domain from .ru to .org. In 2012, following the publication on his website, the article, The Role of Women in Jihad, by the head of the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, FSB, it's KGB today. FSB officials conducted a search at his home for illegal materials, but didn't find them. You see? Taking into account the way the Russian authorities treat real oppositioners today, it's really very strange generosity. They didn't find anything. Jamal's philosophical conception combines Shia Islamic and leftist rhetorics and includes such ingredients as a militant political Islamism, anti-imperialism, Marxism, a strategic anti-Western alliance of Islam and Orthodox Christianity, conspiracy theories concerning the modern world ruled by transnational corporations, supranational elites, the US, the CIA, Israel, and world Zionism, plus an appropriation of German Romanticism and Christian liberation theology, and not least a rejection of Sufism and the Arab establishment. In 2004, Jamal explained the Arab-Israeli conflict from his interpretation of Islamic philosophy as a struggle over Abraham's inheritance because the Jews rejected the right of Ishmael. Islam in this struggle represent the real Judaism and the real Christianity, because Abraham and Moses, according to Jamal, called their tradition Islam. Thus, Jews have to recognize that Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem is the third temple, and the Amar Khalif Amar is the Messiah, as was accepted by many Jews who converted to Islam after Jerusalem was conquered by Muslims. According to Jamal, those converted Jews are the are ancestors of the Palestinians who are the legitimate owners of the Holy Land, and not the newcomers of mixed Polish, German, Finnish, Slavic origin from Lithuania. The only solution I was ready to get everything except Finnish origin. Surprisingly. 1,000 Jews in all Finland. The only solution of the conflict lies in dismantling the apartheid state of Israel and replacement by the all-citizen state of Palestine. Jamal is not exclusively a religious thinker. As an active politician, he consistently rejects the right of the state of Israel to exist in political terms. We can see an example of similar thinking in his 2008 remarks on the Armenian-Azeri conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I quote, "Armenia as a state should be dismantled. In that is hidden the key for the settlement of the conflict. Are you surprised? Who say it should be settled peacefully? Moreover, I don't call for an extermination of Armenians. As a matter of fact, Armenians may get on in the territory of Yerevan Hanat, which means in the territory of Azerbaijan. For goodness sake, they may live their life peacefully, fix shoes and play on fives. Just Armenia's independent state should be, that's all. The same way Israel shouldn't be. This is the fundamental request of all faithful Muslims. Jews may live there only as citizens of the united Palestinian state. Nobody say that Jews should be exterminated. Well, thanks. In Jamal anti-Zionist rhetoric, Holocaust denial plays a significant role. In the same 2009 article, he argued that the United States made use of Zionism since 1943 in order to dismantle defeated Europe by using the Holocaust as a baton against the whole Europe. Moreover, he considered the Holocaust to be an American instrument to justify its military presence in the Europe after the Second World War, in order to protect Jews from the anti-Semitic European elites. I mentioned it's after the war, anti-Semitic European elites. But Holocaust denial is not Jamal's goal in itself. He uses it to pave the way to replace the issue of the Jewish genocide by the Palestinian one. In April 2009, in an interview concerning the position of the Iranian president and well-known Holocaust denier Ahmadinejad, he noted, I quote, "Israel is a fascist state that transformed the issue of Holocaust into a religious postulate, relying on its lobbying, first of all, in the European countries to persecute those who try to deal with the history of this issue. Actually, this way, it completely falsified the norms of freedom of speech and democracy in the European Union, and under the cover of this quasi-religious postulate carried out the crimes, systematically carried out the genocide of the Palestinian people," end of quote. He blamed the Palestinian chairman Mahmoud Abbas and the Egyptian president, then Hosni Mubarak, for betraying the Palestinian people by negotiating with the Israeli delegation headed by the Minister of the Foreign Affairs, Avigdor Lieberman. According to Jamal, Hamas and only Hamas is a legal representative of the Palestinians. Presenting Hamas as the only legitimate representative of the Palestinians, he tries to bring it closer to Russia. In 2010, Jamal considered that the visit of the Hamas delegation to Russia is a gift to Moscow. At the time of the crisis of the Israeli state that was collaborating with the traitors of the Palestinian people, Mahmoud Abbas. This position isn't surprising if we recall that 4 years before, in 2006, he described the real face of Hamas: human, civilized, and beautiful. However, Jamal's final goal is not dismantling Israel or even the establishment of the Palestinian state. The biggest challenge for him is a world Jewry. Jamal in November 2012 declared that the Jews created the common ideological system in the West in which Jews are taken as holy and infallible. That the Jews replaced Jesus as the perfect victim. Therefore, he sees the delegitimization of Israel as an essential component in the global struggle against world Jewry, which symbolized the modern civil religion. An important step in this global war is driving a wedge between Israel and world Jewry. Following this logic, the collapse of Israel will be the only first step in the decline of world Jewry and finally of the United States. And then we go to our third person of interest, Maxim Shevchenko. Okay. Okay. So Maxim Shevchenko was born in Moscow in 1966. In 1990, he graduated from the Moscow Aviation Institute. He also attended lectures of Oriental Studies at the Institute of Asia and Africa at Moscow State University. He has worked as a journalist since 1987 for the Messenger of Christian Democracy and correspondent for hotspots Afghanistan, Pakistan, Chechnya, Dagestan, Yugoslavia, and the Middle East for the Independent newspaper. In 2000, he established the Center for Strategic Studies of Religion and Politics of the Modern World. Between 2005 and 2011, his TV show Judge for Yourself was broadcast in prime time on Russian TV's Channel 1. However, it was closed at the demand of the Russian Jewish Congress because Shevchenko had declared that the terrorist attack by Andreas Breivik in Oslo, Norway, was the result of his neo-Nazi views and sympathy to Israel. In 2008 and 2010, Shevchenko was a member of the public chamber of the Russian Federation, put into the office by presidential declaration. He is a member of the Anti-Orange Committee established in 2012 as a framework for various anti-democratic activists who see the current developments in several ex-Soviet republics as an American plot against Russia. He also a member of the Izborsk Club, an intellectual think tank of nationalist and leftist writers, historians, journalists, and scientists. Please. Could you? Yeah. This is the Anti-Orange Committee, and this is the Izborsk Club symbols. Those Gongo, government-organized NGOs, are aggressively loyal to the Putin regime and resist sympathetic treatment from Kremlin. Shevchenko combines militant Orthodox Christianity and neo-leftist ideas, asserting the uniqueness of the Russian development, along with the adoption of European anti-Enlightenment theories applied to the modern situation in Russia. He offers selective criticism of the establishment, quite often used to camouflage his anti-Semitic attitudes. Strong opposition to Western liberalism in favor of the real people's democracy, glorification of austerity and asceticism, citing that of the Taliban leaders and Iran's former president Ahmadinejad, in opposition to the corrupt Western elites. He idolizes the just social norms and solidarity within the religious communities. He is homophobic and expresses sympathy for elements of Soviet past, for example, internationalism and egalitarianism. Of particular note is his Islamophilia. Shevchenko asserts that he is an anti-Zionist but has great respect for Judaism. He supported a Jewish person, Ilya Farber, a village teacher arrested by the FSB, for example, and criticized the neo-Nazi parties, but he quite soon reveals his anti-Semitic views. In criticizing the Russian tycoons, he almost exclusively points to the oligarchs with obviously Jewish names. In other case, he expressed his opposition to the idea of Russian world, preferring the term Orthodox world, because, I quote, Brighton and Haifa also may belong to the Russian world. So Brighton is a part of New York, settled mainly by Russian speakers with a significant number of Jews among them. So he blamed the Hungarian party Jobbik and the Greek Golden Dawn for anti-Semitism, and at the same time he praised the Freedom Party of Austria and Marine Le Pen's Front National, the Greek party and the Greek party Syriza, claiming, "We proud of all who say today in Europe in German, Volksverräter gegen Verräter." People's representative against European traitors, and please pay attention, in Russian translation he added the word European. I have no idea about the origin of this German slogan, I may just suggest, but he deliberately added in the Russian translation the word European traitors. He doesn't hide, he doesn't hide his anti-Zionism and only try to present as development of his struggle for global justice. Therefore, he blamed Israel for almost any event in the region. Thus, according to Shevchenko, the only threat to the Middle East, is not Iranian nuke program, but Israel and its allies, Saudi Arabia and right-wing Republicans. In 2014, he accused Israel for poisoning Yasser Arafat with polonium, arguing that it was in response to Arafat's refusal to transfer the land under the Al-Aqsa Mosque in order to reconstruct so-called, in his word, so-called temple. He exaggerated Israeli brutality, and I quote, "They, Israelis, killed many Palestinian leaders in various countries of the world. They poisoned them, strangled. They strangled one of the Hamas leaders in Dubai. Anytime when they kill in the territory of the other state some Palestinian, they declare him a terrorist that they have to kill. It means they, Israeli security service, commit acts of terror and always goes unpunished from prosecutions and from lawsuits. Why? How? I don't know. Ask AIPAC. That makes its lobbying efforts in the U.S. at the level of the Congress. Maybe they will explain why they, Israelis, go unpunished after committing terror acts all over the world. Shevchenko wants Russians and Palestinians to form closer ties based on so-called their common destiny and to widen the gap between Russians and Israelis. And I quote, "Russian correlates with Palestinians and not with Israelis. Israelis are migrants that came there from different countries, have armed themselves, expelled the indigenous people. One tries to force us to think that Russians and Israelis are the people of the common destiny. Palestinians and Russians are the people of the common destiny. Palestinians are loading their own lands, they live there, and the migrants expel them from there." His pro-Muslim position, including the criticism of some aspects of Russian policy in the Caucasus, led him to simultaneous confrontation with Russian nationalists and so-called pro-Israeli lobbyists. Thus, in 2011, Evgeny Satanovsky, the director of the Moscow-based Institute of the Middle East, attacked Shevchenko's pro-Islamic lobbying, who counterattacked claiming that Satanovsky's dual citizenship make him doubtfully loyal to Russia. And moreover, it makes him, along with other political scientists with Russian and Israeli citizenship, to behave in Russia as representatives of the colonial administration in the multinational country that they actually hate. He also accused them of inciting hatred among the various people of Russia, for provocation of the ethnic-based riots in Russia, supporting the Israeli policy of segregation of Muslims in Russia in order to create a fake image of common Russian-Israeli struggle with the Islamic world. He also accused the Russian security forces of cooperation with Israel in the fight against terror and for adopting Israeli methods based on the racial segregation. In conclusion, I would like to stress several points of great importance for the current situation. First of all, the incorporation of the ultra-nationalists of the types presented into mainstream political discourse took place during the last 10-15 years in Russia. Secondly, anti-Semitism, overt, camouflaged, and anti-Zionism have been and remained an essential part in the ideology of the ultranationalists, and this fact doesn't make them pariahs in the Russian political establishment. At best, as it happened in Dugin case, the incorporation into the mainstream forces forces them to demonstrate a certain flexibility in their views toward Jews and Israel. Third, modern anti-Zionism in Russia revived the Soviet stereotypes on Zionism as a part of the global evil controlled by the United States. However, unlike in the Soviet time, the modern anti-Zionists make efforts to mispresent Israel as an immediate enemy of an average Russian. Fourth, they promote the idea of the common Palestinian-Russian destiny on various public stages. Thus, in 2004, Jamal and Shevchenko participated in the round table concerning the aftermath of the assassination of Sheikh Yassin. Shevchenko called for giving Russian citizenship to at least 1.5 million Palestinians to increase Russian involvement in the Middle East and to defeat the pro-Israeli lobby in Russia. In January 2009, Jamal and Shevchenko signed the declaration of the Coordination Council in support of the struggle of the Palestinian people that described the Palestinian struggle as an example of honor and dignity for all humankind, and claiming that the United States, by hand of the Israeli butchers, kills thousands of Palestinian children, women, and the elderly. In April 2012, I'm going to finish this, I know. In April 2012, a demonstration by pro-Palestinian activists took place in front of the Israeli embassy in Moscow, please. Among the speakers were Jamal Shevchenko and Nadezhda Kevorkova, Shevchenko's wife and comrade in arms. Please, one more. You may guess who is who. Shevchenko stated the Palestinians are the symbols of common Christian-Muslim union against the Israeli aggression and Russian people, and he used the word Российский народ, not ethnic Russian, but the whole Russian people, and the Russian people should help them. I quote, "We will not allow to the enemy to crush the Palestinian people exactly the same way we will not allow the enemy to crush the multinational Russian people." Again, Российский народ. Kevorkova emphasized the physical suffering of the arrested Palestinians, exaggerating Israeli brutality. I quote, "The Israelis placed Palestinian prisoners, women, men, and the elderly and children, with bound hands and legs, and blindfolded on the small baby stool, and leave them in this position for 2 to 3 days. It's difficult to believe. After that, they place a sack over the head of the bound person and sit him in a bus, where for days they play the same melody, usually a Western one. It's especially difficult for Palestinian children because it impacts their psyche." Yeah, some Western melody influenced my psyche also. It was done to break their will. She also told the audience that Israelis practiced medieval torture on the rack and keep prisoners in small ice chambers for as long as for 25 years. But of course, it's not only anti-Zionism that unifies them. A Russian proverb goes, "First love, never die." So the Florian Gaia conceptual club was established in 2011 in Moscow by its chairman, Gaydar Jamal, with participation of both Alexander Dugin and Maxim Shevchenko. Of course, the chosen name may reflect the hero of the German peasants' war in the 16th century, please. One more. Yeah. Chosen name may reflect the hero of the German peasant war in the 16th century. However, the club motto, Trotz Acht und Bann, against fear and hate, was taken from the hymn, or slogan, of the Die 8th SS Kavallerie Division Florian Geier, the 8th SS Cavalry Division Florian Geier. Thank you very much.
Please give a round of applause to Samuel, Sarah, and Lawrence for the 3 outstanding presentations. We do have about 10, 12 minutes for questions. Some of us in the audience, myself included, there's a rush of nostalgia for the bad old days, so I'll just take 30 seconds. Some of you know Tancred Golompolsky. He was the editor in Moscow of a Jewish paper, and he was put on trial in Moscow for publishing that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was false. He was put on trial. So my colleague Shimon Samuels and I went there, and on the way in, a Russian woman came over to me shaking her fist. I remember it. She said, "You dirty Jew, Zionist, Mossad agent, Chassid." So I don't speak Russian, but I asked Shimon to please tell her the following: "I'm not a Chassid." Okay, please, really want to go right around the room. Joel.
I'll be very brief. I'm going to make a statement that's not a question, but when I heard Sarah and Samuel, I think we have to give some attention to the idea of ideological crossovers, because all of the thinking is terribly confused, but we should try to ask the question what these people really want. But when we think, let's say, of the 70s, there was the crossover of the cooperation of the communists and the Muslims and terrorist groups on the left and so on. The question I would ask, or I think the area for future research, would be ideological crossovers.
Thank you. Let's try to take some more comments and questions, then we'll ask our speakers for their final. Please.
My question is for Samuel Barnard. Do you treat the field of Turkish ex-Soviet republic who had collaborated with the SS during the German Nazi during the Second World War? Because this will be an interesting follow-up to explain the situation today. As you know, I don't have to tell you that there were many Muslims from Eurasia that went as SS in the Nazi army, and even in the camp.
Okay, second. Professor Wistridge?
I have one question for Lawrence and one for both of the last 2 speakers. To Lawrence, my question relates to something you touched on regarding the Catholic Church, which I wonder if you could slightly elaborate. It seems like there are two distinct trends here. One, going back to the very courageous group who were quite pioneering in their day of the Polish Catholic intelligentsia, that initiated a new look at the whole question of Jewry. And then you have the contradictory trend already in the 1980s, but seems to have carried through. There was the Carmelite controversy, of course. The rather mixed reception towards Pope John Paul II's initiatives. And then bringing it up to date, which you certainly suggested, the debate of the historians about the Polish participation in massive atrocities. The split seems to be between the ethno-nationalists, as you said. How much of a Catholic component is there in that, to which we might, in addition, throw in Radio Maria, of course? Regarding the two fascinating presentations about Russia, and following on this question about what I would call hybridism, of kind of ideological hybridism, in which almost every conceivable strand, ideologically from the Soviet era, but then post-Soviet, everything from Islamic fundamentalism, Eurasianism. Is there any common denominator to all these crossovers, these hybrids, beyond perhaps the more obvious thing, one, anti-Zionism that you clearly expounded, and the other being the anti-Western, very powerful anti-Western critique or denunciation. The West is decadent, the West is declining. Maybe this is the time to recreate a great Russian power.
Thank you. Lawrence, you want to take it now?
Yeah,
let's take it from here? Yeah, let's take it from there.
First of all, Robert, I'd like to thank you for asking that question, because unfortunately, in the parameters of what I presented, there wasn't room to touch upon that, or at least expand upon it. The Catholic component is always a very important one in the Polish context, though we could argue that it is a component that, at least to some extent, is in decline. There's a tendency, of course, to look upon the Catholic Church, whether in Poland or elsewhere, as being a monolithic institution, and of course it's not monolithic, and there are many different discussions within the Church, and many different, we could call them perhaps strands. And yes, you can identify on the one hand a very conservative element within the Church, ethno-nationalist, which doesn't have a lot of patience, one, for ecumenical dialogue, and two, for any attempt to reassess Polish history. On the other hand, you have a much more progressive group within the Church, which does reach out to the Jews. They sponsor every year a Day of Judaism, which attempts at least to educate some of the participants. What is Judaism? How can Jews and Poles dialogue? When I say that the Church is an element in decline, the influence of the Church, certainly among the intelligentsia, again, in the big cities, among more modern people, is not what it once was. And I would argue it will continue down the same path. It may sound strange, but the best period for the Roman Catholic Church was actually during the years of communist rule, when it really did enjoy tremendous popular support. Very few Catholics would tell you that. Very few believing Catholics, certainly not the clergy, but this is something that's really quite unmistakable. If I can just take 1 minute more, there is something I did want to make clear that I wasn't able to in my paper, and that is that if you look at anti-Semitism in Poland today, and this is the reason why I stress so much the historical discussion, it's really very, very dissimilar to what you find in Western Europe or in many other parts of the world, because it has really very little, or I would argue almost nothing, to do with the existence of a Jewish community in Poland today, which, to everyone's surprise, has been revived, but is still a very negligible size. And the Jewish community may be a certain lightning rod, but the anti-Semitism that you see in Poland today is really something more dealing with Jewish ghosts, with virtual Jews, than it is with live ones. And it also has very little to do with the events in the Middle East. Now, we could discuss in Western Europe, you see a lot going on, and to what extent is hostility to Zionism and to Israel present in what's happening in Western Europe. But in Poland, this isn't really the case. You don't have a significant community of people of Middle Eastern origin. And when Israel is mentioned, it's usually as a kind of second front. We're angry at the Jews for this discussion about history. Let's also attack Israel. And funnily enough, I don't see him here in the room today. Manfred Gerstenfeld once asked me to discuss this with him about 10 or 15 years ago. And at that point, I said, you know, Manfred, there are a lot of people who believe that the Polish accession to the European Union, Poland's integration with Europe, will actually reduce anti-Semitism in Poland. It will be a positive influence. And I said to him at that time, frankly, I think it will be a negative influence because there's a lot of sympathy in Poland for Israel, and I think that the European influence on Poland will actually reduce that sympathy and support. I say that not because I think I was correct in that evaluation, but simply that explains why the Polish media is much more lukewarm toward Israel today than it was, let's say, 15 years ago. So I hope I've answered your question and also at least been able to introduce one other element. What anti-Semitism in Poland does have, by the way, in common with anti-Semitism in other countries is mostly with anti-Semitism that you see today in other post-communist countries in East Central Europe that don't have a big Jewish community any longer. So Hungary, I mean, there is a big vital Jewish presence in Hungary, but we could talk about Romania, for example, where the tropes that you see deal mainly with history.
Okay, Sarah, go ahead.
The question about the ideological crossover, thank you for raising this point. In fact, the whole history of the Soviet Union is about recycling images, discourses, stereotypes about Jews from the pre-revolutionary period to the 1920s, to the suspicion towards non-territorialized minority groups, suspicions of double allegiance. So you can write a history of the recycling of images. The question is, to what extent is it really useful to follow those trajectories? I'm thinking about the Front National in France. The Front National in France, you can find a lot of crossovers from being a very deeply anti-Semitic party, shifting towards a more anti-Muslim rhetoric, but keeping this anti-Semitic core. I'm not sure it is fruitful to really focus on the crossovers. What I think is more important is to focus on the influence and the impact of those ideologies. And this is a question that I have for Samuel, is to what extent, Putin said that Dugin's book was on his, how do you call this?
Nightstand.
Exactly. To what extent does this really influence Putin's vision and Russia's politics, Russia's return to the Middle East? To what extent will this influence Russia's relation with Hamas? You know that Russia blessed the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation. There's a lot of new thinking about this. So I think my own research, I hope to deal with what is the real impact of all this.
Shmuel, you have a few closing words?
Yeah.
Hold on.
So, very short answer to your questions about the ideological crossovers. Obviously, I absolutely agree with Sarah. It's a recycling of recycling and recycling of images. And I would add only one point. It's a very poor, I would call first-hand ideological production of Russian origin. When we check these ideological stereotypes and these images, is actually mainly taken from the Western sources. When I read Dugin or Shevchenko or any other person, they just adopt these materials to the Russian situation. You see the clear evidences, clear traces of the, for example, German or French right-wing extreme thinkers, philosophers of the 19th century, early 20th centuries. It's absolutely obvious. And again, it's permanent recycling of the images. As to the Nazi-Muslim collaborators, you asked it very brief. Of course, there was several units in the Nazi army organized for the Soviet prisoners of war of Muslim origin. For example, Turkestan Legion, Bergman Division. It was for Caucasians, but some of them were from Azerbaijan and non-Caucasian. And, for example, Itil-Ural detachment for Tatars and Bashkirs mainly. It's difficult to discuss it now in Russia because of the last legislation concerning to the historical research of the Second World War, which stops actually any free discussion of these events, of these developments, because the authority, the Kremlin, don't want to open the stage for the discussion of the collaboration of Russians, for example, with the Nazi occupation. So they have sort of slogans like Bandera fascists, all Ukrainians were supporters of Hitler and they praised him, and that's it. Stop here, we don't want further discussion on this issue, otherwise we will see you in the court.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry to the 5 people who had the questions, but you could meet the 3 speakers somewhere between the Teinana and the coffee. Kol hakavod to each of you. Thanks again.